So if I could choose a way to be different, that would be it. Our topic this week was prompted by a video clip that I saw of Brandon Sanderson talking about how he refers to J.R. Tolkien as Grandpa Tolkien. And his explanation of that is something that we'll go into a little bit later, where we're looking at how we see the different generations of fantasy fiction and what we might anticipate for an upcoming generation. And it kind of was coincidental that also this week I happened to finish reading the Lord of the Rings, the full trilogy, minus the appendices. That was just a little bit too much, but even that goes into a little bit about what we'll talk about later. What was your experience this week from reading?
So I've finished one book and started reading another book. I've gotten a good way through, but in both I found a pattern that I think is worth looking into emulating in some way, and that is both of them. There's at some point in the book, there are characters that believe that another character or an organization is going to be the solution for the problem, and it ends up that they're unwilling to be the solution, and in both cases actually end up making the problem worse. And I think that's a great way of raising the stakes, where something that you had previously thought of as being helpful and being at least somewhat on your side ends up not being. And now all of a sudden, what you were relying on as your solution is out the window, and you have to find something completely different to solve the problem.
It's like exactly the opposite of I can never remember that Latin phrase.
Deus ex machina?
That, where it forces the characters to exercise their own agency to overcome the problem. And it's neat to notice the pattern. I think it's also something to be careful of, that we don't get too formulaic about,
Right.
Well, this is about the time where we need to introduce the failure of what they were depending on. So yeah, it's really good to see what we want to borrow and what we don't want to borrow. And that really also plays into how we were looking back at the generations of history of the fiction of fantasy. And just curious if you can explain how we think about the generations, at least leading up to where we are now.
Right. So you mentioned Brandon Sanderson seeing Tolkien as the literary grandfather. I think we can go one big step further back to the father for Tolkien of fantasy, going all the way back to books like the Iliad and Odyssey, and even much later on, or much earlier, how does that work, of much more recently, there we go, of Beowulf. Even that's a long time ago. All of those we kind of lump together as like the first generation of fantasy. And then you've got Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and all of his works. And
what do you think makes him a different generation than all the other stuff that was before him?
I think when comparing him especially to like the Iliad and the Odyssey, a lot of those are stories that were created in existing mythologies, whereas Tolkien just created his own new mythology, and he created a history of the world that he's writing the book in before he even wrote the book and writing the Silmarillion. And just all of this detail that he has created himself, rather than taking a world that already exists with the Greek mythology and the gods and things like that, and placing a story into that. I think that's a big way in which he is different. And then also just the scope and scale of what he is doing in creating this 6-book, 3-volume story. And that's just Lord of the Rings, not to mention all the other works that he has done there. And the world is just so much bigger and more in depth than something like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
And then Brandon Sanderson refers to Robert Jordan and his ilk as like the second generation. They're the ones who were Yeah, he considered them the following generation. They're the ones who grew up reading Tolkien. And when we look at something like Robert Jordan's work, it was a full 15 volumes. So it just greatly expanded the size of the story. And then Brandon Sanderson's work, while he didn't take a single story and make it orders of magnitude larger, he took what was one story, and then his approach was to make lots of stories in a giant universe of story that he calls the Cosmere. So that seems to be the progression from one generation to the next. And then we got to thinking, well, what would the next generation look like? And you can't just take an entire universe and make it an order of magnitude larger. I guess you could and have multiverse, which is what Marvel Cinematic Universe is trying to do. But that wouldn't be the way I would want to go if I were to try to figure out what the next generation looks like. But one of the things that I do think I would want to try to put more of into a story is more like what C.S. Lewis did some of this in threads between the fantasy world and the real world. We can see that he intended to make some parallels, similar to how, say, Gulliver's Travels and much of Jonathan Swift's work really intended to draw some parallels. What I would hope is that in our writing, what makes us different, or the next generation, if you will, would be that we would have many more threads, a more depth in the connection between the fantasy world of our fiction and the real world of our readers, without necessarily falling into the trap of becoming allegory or fable. So if I could choose a way to be different, that would be it.
But that's a difficult way to be different. I don't think it's as difficult, well, maybe it is, as going that extra order of magnitude. Because I look at the effort that has to go into like each generation, and it seems like the effort that's going in is almost getting more and more from, having an existing mythology that you're working in, creating your own mythology, creating 15 books, creating all these different series and completely different storylines that are in the same universe and follow the same rules but are slightly different.
And when I look at how much time do I have left in my life, going bigger probably doesn't seem feasible. And I would rather go deeper, even if that means that it's not as, say, marketable as, that I'm not writing as many stories or anything like that. If I can go deeper and have a stronger connection that makes people think about important topics in real life without feeling like they're being preached at or manipulated, that's the way I would want to do it.
And that still takes a lot of effort.
Right. So our question for you, what is a difference that you would want to see in the next generation of sci-fi or fantasy? Let us know in the comments. We won't see you in 2 weeks because at the time that we're recording, that will be Christmas for us. So we're going to be on vacation. We're going to take a 4-week break instead of a 2-week break. But let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we will see you in 4 weeks.